There's some foods that exist beyond taste. Some foods carry migration, some foods that carry labor, adaptation, and history inside a single pot. And few dishes reveal the long history of the Black Atlantic more clearly than jambalaya. Because for years, people across the African diaspora have debated a question that sounds simple on the surface, but becomes much larger the deeper you examine it. Did jambalaya come from jollof rice? At first glance, it could feel like a casual internet argument, or another round of the so-called jollof wars between Nigerians and Ghanaians online. But beneath that conversation exists something far more important than recipes. What people are really asking is whether traces of Africa survived the violence of slavery strongly enough that they can be recognized centuries later in Black American foodways. And if we're going to answer that question honestly, we cannot begin in New Orleans, Louisiana. We can't even begin in the United States. We have to begin in West Africa long before America became America. Because one of the greatest distortions in the history of slavery is the assumption that Africans arrived in the Americas without systems, without expertise, and without sophisticated forms of knowledge. But history says otherwise. Long before Europeans built plantation economies across the Atlantic world, West African societies had already developed advanced systems of agriculture, trade, governance, and environmental engineering. In regions historians often call the Rice Coast, in areas including present-day Senegal, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, communities cultivated rice generations before Europeans understood how profitable rice agriculture could become. These were not just simply farming practices. Rice cultivation required special knowledge passed from one generation to the next over centuries. Farmers understood flood cycles, irrigation systems, wetland environment, soil management, and seasonal timing. Entire communities built agricultural systems capable of producing rice efficiently in difficult ecological conditions. Rice wasn't merely food. It represented technology, expertise, coordination, and inherited cultural knowledge. And that matters because when the transatlantic slave trade expanded across the Atlantic world, Europeans were not simply capturing laborers, they were forcibly extracting agricultural expertise. And that distinction is important for AP African American Studies students, because Unit 1 repeatedly challenges the idea that African societies existed outside intellectual or technological development before European colonization. But in reality, enslaved Africans often carried forms of expertise that plantation economies depended upon. The Carolina rice economy became one of the clearest examples. Historians and food scholars have pointed out the wetlands of the Carolina Lowcountry resembled environments where many West Africans had already cultivated rice successfully. Plantation owners wanted access not only to African labor, but to African agricultural knowledge. Enslaved Africans understood how to engineer irrigation systems, manage tidal flooding, and cultivate wet rice agriculture on a massive scale. So imagine standing waist-deep in mosquito-filled marshes before sunrise while heavy humidity presses up against your skin. Imagine spending hours bent over rice fields under brutal heat conditions while surrounded by standing water, snakes, disease, and exhaustion. That was the reality for many enslaved Africans forced into the rice plantations of the Carolina Lowcountry. But even under those conditions, they carried techniques that plantation owners themselves often didn't possess. The fields that generated enormous wealth for the Atlantic economy depended upon knowledge systems forged generations earlier in West and Central Africa. And perhaps that changes the way we should think about food itself, because food is often treated as something secondary to history. We talk about wars and laws and presidents and revolutions and economies while pretending food exists somewhere outside of those stories. But food often reveals the movement of power more clearly than textbooks do. Food tells us who labored, food tells us who migrated, food tells us whose expertise became profitable, and in the case of Black foodways across the Atlantic world, food also reveals what endured despite centuries of displacement and violence. And this is where the conversation becomes more historically complicated, because modern discussions about jambalaya and jollof rice sometimes flatten the diversity of the African diaspora itself. Food historian Jessica B. Harris has pointed out that many early enslaved Africans brought into English North America in 1619 came from Angola rather than Ghana or Senegal. And that reminder matters because Africa is not culturally singular. The transatlantic slave trade scattered multiple ethnic groups, languages, religions, and cultural traditions across the Atlantic world. Historians therefore have to be careful not to reduce every African influence in Black American culture into one simplified origin story. But historical complexity does not erase the cultural connection. Across the western coast of Africa stood places like Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle, where enslaved Africans passed through what became known as the Door of No Return, before being forced on slave ships bound for the Americas. And inside those ships traveled more than just human beings. They carried knowledge patterns, spiritual systems, expertise, music, cooking, understanding of spice, texture, and communal eating practices. Recipes did not survive because someone carefully preserved cookbooks inside plantation cabins. Many Africans were denied literacy intentionally. So recipes survived because culture survived orally. Grandmothers taught daughters, families taught communities. Measurements lived inside instinct rather than text. Flavor became something preserved through repetition, adaptation, and collective practice. And perhaps nowhere is that continually more visible than in rice dishes themselves. Across the African diaspora, one-pot rice dishes appear repeatedly in different forms. In Senegal, there's jollof rice. In Louisiana, there's jambalaya. In the Carolina Low Country, there's red rice. Across Black Southern foodways, rice has become foundational not simply because it was available, but because rice culture already existed within the knowledge systems enslaved Africans carried with them. The ingredients evolved depending upon geography and trade networks, but certain patterns remain visible. Layered seasoning, communal preparation, rice as a centerpiece rather than a side dish, and the ability to stretch ingredients collectively within families and communities. But the story becomes even more fascinating when we examine tomatoes, because tomatoes are not indigenous to West Africa at all. Tomatoes originated in Central America and spread globally through imperial trade systems connected to colonialism and by the Columbian Exchange. So by the 19th century, tomatoes had become integrated into many West African dishes, including forms of jollof rice. And that historical detail matters because it complicates simplistic origin stories. You see, jambalaya is not simply a frozen copy of an ancient African recipe carried unchanged across the Atlantic. Instead, both jollof and jambalaya evolved inside interconnected Atlantic worlds shaped by migration, colonialism, trade, slavery, and adaptation. These dishes resemble one another not because history remained static, but because cultures across the diaspora adapted creatively while still carrying older traditions forward. And honestly, that may be even more powerful, because the miracle is not cultural purity, the miracle is cultural endurance. The extraordinary part of this history is that people enduring unimaginable violence still manage to preserve fragments of themselves strongly enough that centuries later their descendants continue recognizing echoes of those traditions across oceans. And maybe that explains why food conversations like this matter so much to young people today. Because in recent years, many people across the African diaspora have become increasingly interested in reconnecting with African culture through music and fashion, travel, language, and food. Some scholars describe part of this phenomenon using the term Afropolitanism, which broadly refers to modern global connections between African peoples in the wider diaspora. Now, for students, that idea may sound abstract at first, but honestly, many of you have already seen it. When artists like Burna Boy sell out arenas across the world, when Afrobeat rhythms influence American music, and when Black Panther filled movie screens with Afrocentric aesthetics, and when TikTok creators debate whose family makes the best jollof rice, those moments reflect something larger than trends. They reflect a generation attempting to reconnect pieces of a global identity that slavery and colonialism once tried to fracture. And so food becomes one of the easiest ways to begin that reconstruction because it feels personal in ways textbooks do not. You can taste it, you can smell it, you can gather around with your family. A historical document may feel distant, but a recipe passed down through generations feels immediate. And for many African Americans whose ancestral histories were disrupted by slavery, Foodways sometimes becomes one of the few remaining archives of cultural connection available to them. That doesn't mean every dish can be traced perfectly to one African ethnic group or exact historical moment. Joanne Hippolyte reminds us that food history often relies upon oral histories, fragmented records, travel writings, and cultural practices rather than perfectly preserved written evidence. But imperfect evidence does not erase the larger truth that African influence fundamentally shaped the food systems of the Americas. Maybe this is the most important lesson in this entire conversation, because when students learn in AP African American Studies, one of the central themes of this course is cultural continuity across the African diaspora. Our course repeatedly asks students to examine what persisted despite during slavery, displacement, and oppression. Music persisted, spiritual traditions and religion persisted, language patterns persisted, and foodways endured as well. Rice dishes became visible reminders that enslaved Africans did not emerge from cultural emptiness. They carried systems, techniques, creativity, and inherited knowledge into the Americas, even while slavery attempted to strip them of their identity itself. So maybe the question is not whether jambalaya is simply copied from jollof. Maybe the deeper question is why so many people want that connection to exist in the first place. And I think a part of that answer is because people want evidence that history did not completely erase them. They want evidence that despite slavery, despite colonialism, despite the Atlantic crossing, something endured strongly that descendants separated by oceans can still recognize pieces of each other inside a shared pot of rice centuries later. Empires tried to erase names, languages, families, but somehow through adaptation, ritual, community, they inherited tradition, and the pot remembered what history tried to forget. This is Dr. Kamasi Hill with the Griot's History, and always remember, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the story alive.